Okay, welcome everyone again to another episode. Today we have Father Patrick join us again. How you doing, Father?
I'm well, thanks to God. How are you?
Yeah, doing good. Today's video will be on, it's called The Strongest Biblical Argument for the Papacy, and this is on the Benjamin John channel, which I believe is by Ben Bollinger. So you have for me about 10 segments or so that we should go through.
Yeah.
So yeah, the video is quite long, so like I said, we'll try to get through this. So yeah, let's jump into it here.
What is the primary meaning of the primacy that St. Peter was afforded over the Apostolic College? Does Peter's headship over the apostles primarily signify the office of bishop, the office of archbishop or patriarch, the office of the pope? What then does Matthew 18's commission to the rest of the apostles signify? Depending on which apologist you ask, you're likely to get a variety of answers. If we go the route of many Eastern Orthodox and even some Anglican apologists, which is that Matthew 16 is primarily about Peter being instituted as the archetype for all monarchical bishops, that is, episcopal heads with direct, immediate, and ordinary jurisdiction over their local diocese. If we go this route, it does create a bit of a problem. In this scheme, because the apostles were given the exact same Petrine episcopal ministry in Matthew 18 that Peter was given in Matthew 16, the historical man Peter doesn't seem to have any unique relation to the rest of the apostles at all, which directly contradicts the patristic witness, as I've demonstrated in my most recent article on this subject. Indeed, it begs the question of why Matthew 16 and 18 even exist as two separate texts in the first place. If the primary meaning of the New Testament's Petrine texts is just Peter, the apostles, and the bishops all carry out the exact same episcopal ministry within the church, then the very existence of a Petrine commission, as distinct from an apostolic commission, becomes superfluous. As such...
Okay, Father.
Right, yes. Well, I think the video really goes over this point many times. So I'll bring out the primary objection or point of view, which is from the Orthodox. Yes, we take it as the place of St. Peter is primarily focused on the bishop, but we can and do take it at various levels. We can talk about it in terms of metropolitans, we can talk about it in terms of exarchs, patriarchs, and specifically that of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, and later Constantinople. So I'm just going to leave that without much explanation for now. But the question he says he's challenging is that if we say St. Peter's primarily for the local bishop, what meaning is it? Why distinguish him from the others? Because each one is, as I said, singular in his own place. There is no need to pull him out from the others. Now, I think a key conceptual part here is that when he is speaking of the successors of the apostles, he's thinking only in terms of bishops. He is thinking of groups of bishops everywhere. However, if you read St. Ignatius of Antioch, in each diocese where there's a fullness of a church, you have the bishop and presbyters in each place. And the bishop is said to be Christ, and the presbyters are the apostles. So in each diocese, the apostles refers to the presbyters. And then you have the bishop, who is one of the presbyters singled out and takes on the image of Christ among the apostles. So what we have in the place of St. Peter, he is the one that is singled out as the rock, as the one who is seen as Christ among the apostles. in each diocese. All the presbyters have the right to bind and loosen the keys. They can hear confessions, etc. They offer the Eucharist. They act in the general priesthood. But St. Peter takes the place of Christ. So this is the main thing to be pointing out, I want at this stage, is that when we talk about Peter's role with the apostles, we need to remember that it's Peter as the bishop in the diocese vis-a-vis the presbyters, who are the apostolic choir in each place. So it's Christ and the apostles, and St. Ignatius is quite clear on this. So Peter is being pulled out from the apostles in the case of a diocese to take the specific form of Christ, hence the rock, etc. So there's complete and full meaning of a distinction between Peter and the rest in each diocese, because we understand the presbyters as being the apostles following St. Ignatius. So I'll just leave that there for now.
Okay, we'll move on in the video here.
We know that the primary meaning of our Lord's commission to St. Peter is something more than just a theologically abstract archetype for bishops, or even episcopal primates in general, which the apostles also would have been. However, at the same time, this idea that Peter is the archetype for all bishops cannot be readily dismissed either. Many Orthodox apologists are absolutely correct to point out that, through its allusions to certain Old Testament texts, Matthew 16:18-19 indeed portrays Peter as the New Covenant's high priest, the one who can lawfully offer the Eucharistic sacrifice of the New Covenant, as all bishops do. After all, Peter is given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and told that whatever he binds on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever he looses on earth shall be loosed in heaven. As many have observed, this imagery is an allusion to Isaiah 22, wherein Eliakim is established as the Davidic kingdom's royal steward by being given the key of the house of David, being told that what he opens none shall shut, and what he shuts none shall open, and being clothed with a turban and sash, distinctive garments of the high priest. Indeed, the broader context of Isaiah 22 often gets left out of this picture, and as a result, many readers miss a very key, no pun intended, way in which all of the Gospels portray Peter as the New Covenant's high priest. The context of Isaiah 22.
Okay, Father.
Yes, I just wanted to reaffirm that we agree with that. And it's a deep tradition in the Orthodox Church that the bishop is called high priest, and amongst the presbyters who are called the priests. They're all one priesthood. They all have the same grace as priests, teachers, and governors of the church, but one is singled out for the sake of unity, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But in this particular case, we totally agree that Peter is high priest, stands for high priest as the bishop in each diocese. He is the high priest of each diocese. And so, yeah, that is quite correct. So all the information, all the allusions back to the Old Testament, etc., of him being high priest, totally acceptable, and is exactly the role of the bishop among the presbyters in each diocese, is a function of the high priest. And so, yes, but this ministry we understand as high priest is only true for within a diocese. This does not transcend or go beyond the diocese. It doesn't mean that a metropolitan is high priest vis-a-vis the other bishops, nor the patriarchs, high priests vis-a-vis the other patriarchs or bishops, and nor the See of Rome is in such a role. We don't have any liturgical priestly function above that of a diocese, because the whole Catholic Church is present in each diocese. The fullness of a church as a worshiping sacramental body. So there's no further relationship vis-a-vis the priesthood above the local diocese, but there are certainly important relationships of bishops to bishops, but there's not in the liturgical sense of one being the high priest of the others. So this is again something you'll see assumed in his video, that there's some sort of structure. And that comes back to the equation of the apostles with the bishops and failing to understand the distinction between the bishop and the presbyters, and St. Ignatius' discussion of the presbyters as the bishop. So this, the presbyters as the apostles. And so a lot of his objections fail, but if you understand these things. So just reaffirming, we accept that Peter is a high priest, and exactly the high priest in the case of the diocese, and we still call the bishop high priest.
Right. So this connection with the high priest, I found in St. Hippolytus that he equates us with the Episcopate and their power to forgive sins. So that is the role of the high priest.
Yes. I mean, in the presbyters, they have some level of doing that as well. The bishop has a sort of a primary level of that, but even presbyters can do that. But in other words, the keys are shared with the presbyters, but the bishop has a certain level of overall authority on all those matters. But yeah, that is quite consistent with Hippolytus and everyone like that.
Yeah, we can even see in the Council of Trullo, in I believe it's Canon 102, where it actually uses that phrase, the bind and loose, and that applies to the bishops who have the power to give penance. Yeah. All right, so we're going to move a little bit further in the video here.
(21, 15 through 17), Peter and Jesus have their famous dialogue, wherein Peter repents 3 times for his high priestly betrayal of the Lord. And after each "I love you" statement, Jesus replies by telling Peter to, quote, "feed the lambs, shepherd my sheep, and feed my sheep," end quote. Surprisingly, St. John rarely ever uses the imagery of shepherding. His gospel only mentions it one other time, and that's in John 10, 1 through 18, when Jesus identifies himself as the Good Shepherd, in order to demonstrate his headship over the one flock of the church. Similarly, throughout the book of Revelation, which was most certainly written by John, every single time the evangelist uses this verb, to shepherd, it refers to the royal and priestly authority that Jesus exercises as the one shepherd of the church. Thus, if Peter is also going to be shepherding the Lord's flock, then he is Jesus' successor, standing in the place of Christ, our King and High Priest, as the head of the church.
Okay, Father?
Yes, so just again, this is just a reinforcing that the bishop is in the place of Christ, as St. Ignatius says, and carries with that all the shepherding, or other things that Christ does in the church. So this is one of the reasons, again, why St. Peter's specifically called the rock, because Christ is the rock. This is to show that the bishop does stand as the place of Christ among the apostles. And just as a reminder, again, just while I'm thinking about it, that the church, as it says in Ephesians, is founded on Christ and the apostles, and Christ being the chief cornerstone and the apostles. So what happens with the apostles, that they had a global ministry with Peter at the head, and also we must remember that Paul was co-ruler with him. He was prince as well. It wasn't just Peter. And that they had a global ministry of Christ, obviously at the head of them. And then in each place, the global ministry of the bishop apostles is replicated in each place, in each city, and each diocese. And so that is replicated by having one who is Christ, and the bishop and the presbyters who are gathered around him, the apostles. Of course, each bishop himself is really an apostle under Christ. But so what we have, though, is a little model, a little icon, that the bishop and the presbyters are like an icon. So it's not about just bishops being ordained in each place. It's a bishop and presbyters, because in each place you have Christ and the apostles. So in each place, the foundation of a church is grounded on the bishop and the presbyters in each place. And as St. Ignatius says, this is where the church is, with those who were the bishop and the presbyters. It's all together. It's a little choir. It's the apostolic choir with Christ as a head in each place. And that is why the church is Catholic in each place. It's the fullness of the church, because Christ and the apostles are present in each place. That is, the Catholicity of the church is founded on their presence in each place. So yes, we've got the high priest, and Peter is taking the role in the sense of Christ as shepherd of a sheep, feeding the sheep, etc. This is exactly what we expect to see in each diocese. And so the question where how this extends beyond the diocese will come up later. But at this moment, just reinforcing, fully accept all these roles as he's talking about it within each diocese.
Okay, so in line with what you're saying, I just want to bring up a few quotes here. The one is from St. John Chrysostom, and this is referring to where the verse where it says, "Feed my lambs and feed my sheep." He says, "This was not said to the apostles and bishops only, but also to each one of us, however humble, to whom has been committed the care of the flock." So, that goes in line with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also St. Isidore of Seville. He says, "So Peter first received the power of binding and loosing, and he first led people to faith by the power of his preaching. Still, the other apostles have been made equal with Peter in a fellowship of dignity and power. They also, having been sent out into all the world, preach the gospel. Having descended from these apostles, the bishops have succeeded them. And through all the world, they have established the seats of the apostles." Right. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, or
No, just I was thinking that's fine.
okay. All right, let's get back here. We're going to jump a little bit further ahead.
Yep.
Jesus waits for St. Peter, the high priest, to enter the Holy of Holies first, before entering himself. Once again, Peter is shown to be the successor of Jesus, the one who shepherds the sheep and, as high priest, allows the faithful to partake of our Lord's one sacrifice by feeding them with the Eucharistic bread of heaven. Perhaps the listener is wondering, doesn't all this just prove the point of Orthodox apologists? If Peter was the New Covenant's high priest, and monarchical bishops are New Covenant high priests themselves, then doesn't this just mean that Peter's primary role was to serve as a mere archetype for all bishops? Doesn't this mean that Peter himself didn't have a unique, divinely instituted role among the apostles, but was just an image of what they all were? Not at all. Instead, what this demonstrates is that St. Peter was the high priest, the monarchical bishop, over all of the apostles. This is why in John 20, 1-9, it's St. John who waits for St. Peter to enter the Holy of Holies. As the only apostle who remained faithful during our Lord's Passion, John represented all of the apostles. Indeed, by daring to enter the Holy of Holies after Peter, John showed himself to be a fellow apostolic high priest, however, one who's dependent on the first high priest. John's dependence on Peter therefore signifies that each apostle, each bishop, even though he possesses the same high priestly sacramental power as Peter, nonetheless depends on Peter as his own high priest in order to lawfully exercise his ministry. This means that what the apostles and their successors are in relation to their own Eucharistic community, i.e. diocese, Peter and his successors are in relation to the entire apostolic or episcopal college. Just as all priestly ministers in a diocese depend on the monarchical bishop to lawfully offer the Eucharist, so too do all high priests in the church depend on Peter, the first high priest, to licitly serve the sacred liturgy.
Okay, Father?
Right. Well, again, we're quite happy to accept the high priest thing. We can take the tomb when we have a entrance at the liturgy and the high priest is present, the bishop, he goes in first. The rest of the presbyters follow after him. So he first enters into the Holy of Holies at the time of entrance of the gospel. That is the formal entrance in to begin the liturgy. He goes in first. And so, yes, we follow this. Again, you can see that he is sort of trying to push this high priestly ministry into a level beyond the diocese. But remember, if you understand the diocese as Christ and the apostles, Peter is separated out so that there is one chosen from the presbytery, from the priesthood, who stands as high priest, and that high priest then stands in the place of Christ among the apostles. Then everything is perfectly satisfied in each diocese. There's nothing more to be added to this. And we would object to any higher role of metropolitans, exarchs, patriarchs, as having a high priest role vis-a-vis the other bishops. They're all high priests in the context of our own diocese. There's no high priest of high priests, no bishop of bishops, as such as St. Cyprian of Carthage teaches. So we would object to that. And the other little point I was making is why he's adding monarchal bishops. I'm not quite sure what he is intending to imply by monarchal bishops, other than we accept that there is one bishop in each diocese, and so the one beginning, he ordains all the presbyters, he concentrates all the altar, and in the ancient days, he was the only one to consecrate the myrrh used for the chrismation of people after baptism, so that everything is grounded in one. He is a point of unity in monarch. So I suppose that's what he might mean, but other than that, I have a little bit of thoughts that he means absolute monarch, where sort of absolute authority to order everyone around as he wishes. And I have to say, no, that is not the case, that he is an absolute monarch, but certainly a monarch in that way as Christ is monarch of the church. But there's definitely also an equality to be recognized and a respect of that equality of co-rulers, and a limit on the authority that a bishop can exercise over presbyters vis-a-vis they're not his slaves or his servants or as just as extension of himself. They are the apostles which rule with him, sit on the son's throne with him. They have their own authority, and he cannot overturn or that authority or deny that authority without denying them as priests sitting on the throne with him. So there's a certain level where, and he can't order them around to start sweeping the floor or anything as his servants, or carry this or do that. They rule with him, but they do everything of their rule of his consent. And so it's not bossing them around, but everything they do must be with his consent. That everything's done as one. They don't separate themselves from him. They don't do their own church, do their own liturgies at their own will, as if they are their own bishop. So there must be, in a sense, acting with his consent. But it's distinct from bossing them around as a lord and master. There's a respect of their rule, their authority within their own parishes, which must be respected. But anyway, that's a detailed balance to throw it for another conversation. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why he keeps throwing in monarchical, but nevertheless, a bishop is the center of the diocese, the unity of a diocese, the source of all ordinations, and the source of all consent for all the liturgies, and the source of all altars, consecration of altars, so that there may be one liturgy, one Eucharist, and the mystery of a unity of one heavenly thing may be expressed in each place, even though there's multiple parishes, multiple presbyters, and even in a sense, each parish liturgy is the fullness of the liturgy of the church in that place, but it's unified, and it is so in unity with the bishop. So, and also there is something more beyond the diocese where Peter plays an important part. We'll talk about that later, but I'm just pushing back that the idea of high priest, of the liturgical sense, is only that within a diocese.
Yeah, I think they're trying to use that term monarchical because of what the Pope, eventually became in the West. That, he was a monarchy, so that's how they're always going to look at this.
Yes. So I'm just pushing back on that term a little bit. in the sense, I mean, it's true to a degree. It's not something I'm saying is wrong, but it's just interesting why he has to keep adding it in there. And I think that's trying to reinforce a sense of this universal jurisdiction to boss everybody around as Lord and Master of everybody, which is actually a false understanding of how Christ behaves amongst us. And the freedom that Christ gives us to rule with him and to allow that freedom, which is why bishops become heretics, why bishops make mistakes, etc. We actually genuinely, Christ doesn't control us. He doesn't order us around. Absolutely, he gives us certain parameters in which we behave, but he gives us our own freedom to exercise our priesthood, and each bishop and each synod. This is why we have a variety of customs, a variety of ways of doing things. And Christ doesn't control that. He doesn't force them. That's why some bishops and dioceses and regions and patriarchates fall out of the communion of the church, because they fail to stay within the parameters which Christ has set them. But Christ is not controlling them. And so the bishop should have no sense of controlling the presbyters at that level degree, nor patriarchs or other bishops trying to control their subordinate bishops. That's quite opposed to how Christ rules the church.
Okay, let's continue.
As the first high priest to enter the Holy of Holies, the first bishop to offer the Eucharistic sacrifice, Peter and his successors, the popes, are thereby the origin of all sacramental authority and power in the church. And since, as St. Cyprian reminds us, quote, the unity is still preserved in the source, end quote, it follows that the Petrine ministry in Rome is the means by which the church's sacramental unity in faith is forever preserved. The one who sits on the chair of St. Peter is the personal source and guarantor of Eucharistic communion for the entire Apostolic Church. Hence...
Okay.
Right, now this is really starting to focus on the position of the See of Rome. And he's trying to put the high priest thing into that role vis-a-vis the upper bishops. Now, and this, we can start going on into this now, that indeed Rome was considered as a Petrine see. And indeed, the churches were considered to have to converge onto the one see to remain in union. There's one church, and the church is defined by where the bishops are, and the bishops have to be who is a correct bishop, who's not a correct bishop. We're like one family, and that family has a certain heritage, it has a lineage, and it has a recognized sense of who's in the family, who's not. And so, and if you're in the family, you have been begotten of the family as such, a father of the family. And so what I'm describing here is what's called apostolic succession, that the bishops are part of a lineage of bishops, a lineage of fathers, a lineage of patriarchs from whom of the family. And they are ordained by the bishops of the church and recognition that each one is another father in the lineage, in the heritage from back into the apostles, that we are the same family, the same nation. And so this is connected through the physical lineage of father to father, just as in the Old Testament you gave birth to so-and-so. Well, instead of giving birth, there's a rite of ordination. And a bishop is only recognized in the bishop if he is ordained by the other bishops, with the consent of all the other bishops in his diocese, with the metropolitan being the primary one, again, for the sake of unity. So each new bishop is ordained as being recognized as such, taken from his diocese as the single one who is a point of singularity. And he is recognized as such, and that recognizes that diocese as part of the communion of the church. And if you break from and a bishop who separates from his metropolitan is sort of cut off from the church. Well, something has to unite the metropolitans together, and they're united around exarchs of a wider region, which is actually the old Roman imperial diocese, which is an area which incorporates several regions, so it can get confusing with the terminology. And then the exarchs are gathered around either patriarchs as well, or gathered around the patriarchs in the case of Constantinople or Rome. You have a number of exarchs gathered around the principal patriarchs of Rome and New Rome. And so, yes, there is a vergence of unity. And then you do move to 1C, which was first Rome. That is the centre of communion, the centre of the chief father of a family. Otherwise, if we didn't have this and we had totally separate churches, there would be too easy to sort of pull apart. Everyone considers themselves the church of themselves. And we do have a little bit of a problem with this in Orthodox practice now. There's too much. The autocephalous churches think they themselves are the fullness of the church and just look to themselves, and they don't see a sort of a need to keep in unity with the other churches. They do recognize it. They have the diptychs. They make a formal sense. If they're not, they all start talking about them as schismatics or cut off or separated. So they do have a recognition of this. But the priority of 1C, or the See of Rome as a case, has diminished, sadly. But we haven't lost that. Now, importantly here, that in the West, they did talk about the Apostolic See as being the See of Rome, the Petrine See. But if you take Pope St. Gregory the First, or St. Gregory the Great, he's quite clear that the Petrine See isn't just the See of Rome. The Petrine See is 1C with 3 bishops, that of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And you see this even in the First Ecumenical Council when it talks about the priorities of Alexandria and Antioch. It bases them on Rome. Why? Because they are Petrine sees as well. Each one is founded either by Peter or his disciple. So they are, all 3 are the one Petrine see. So it's not the case that just Rome is a Petrine. Alexandria and Antioch are also Petrine. They are the sees of Peter. And Antioch still recognizes this today, and so does Alexandria. So this is a problem. What happened to Rome is it becomes exclusively focused on Rome. Now, Rome does have a wider, higher, more universal jurisdiction than Alexandria and Antioch, so which is something we can go into. But nevertheless, they're all Petrine. So when it comes to being a rock, stability, the center of communion, all 3 are acting in that way. And you'll see even the Monophysites or the Copts and Ethiopians, they will stay around the Sea of Alexandria. And even the Church of India, when it broke off after Chalcedon, remembered the Patriarch of Antioch as the Patron. They stayed in communion with the Patriarch of Antioch. It was the first see, as appropriately it should be. So it had its jurisdiction to the east. Alexandria had it in Africa. And then we get an interesting situation where Constantinople, out of nowhere, suddenly becomes co-equal with Rome, because it's New Rome. It is also takes on the privileges of Rome. That is the Petrine privileges. And it is 1C with Rome. It is a See of Rome in a second location. And this is like Paul was not qualified to be apostle, but God pulled him out from wherever he was and made him co-equal with Peter as a prince of the apostles. In some ways, slightly greater, because he was an apostle to the Gentiles, where Peter was apostle to the Jews. So Paul almost takes on a slightly greater role, but he is co-equal. But yet, in the original qualification replacing Judas, he was not qualified to be an apostle. So this is the same in you can object that Constantinople wasn't sounded by Peter. Yes, it wasn't. But even then, God took Paul, he wasn't qualified to be apostle, and made him prince of the apostles, alongside with Peter. So too, Constantinople is raised up to become prince, the first of the churches, alongside Rome, with all its privileges. So in a sense of its authority and privilege, it is Petrine. Not in its foundation. No, it wasn't founded by Peter. Some will argue it is founded by St. Andrew. But in its authority, it has the same authority as Rome. So when we're talking about Petrine authority, we must be careful that as far as St. Gregory the Great is concerned, it's not exclusively located in Rome. The Rome is a primary expression of that, and it's quite natural to talk about it as the first expression of that, but it's not the exclusive only expression of that. So we need to take all this into account when we're thinking about our rights and the privileges of the churches. And while I'm at it, I'll just add one more part here. There's one of the fundamental problems in the Roman Catholic ecclesiology, or that is being expressed in this video, is, as I said, they seem to take Peter and the apostles as the bishops. And so we have this sort of magisterium. All the bishops are gathered around Peter. And so they reduce the multiple layers of metropolises, exarchs, patriarchs into one type of synod of Peter, and all the bishops are gathered around him. And they make this as if this level is the church at a sacramental level, as if Peter is a bishop among the apostles, which are presbyters. And they consider this as one institution on earth, one liturgical institution, with their Peter at the head as a sole bishop over all the others. And it's sort of like pseudo-presbyters. And they think this is the one institution church. This is not how it's understood by the early fathers, and it's not how Orthodox understand it. Orthodox understand these patriarchates as as I said, each diocese is the fullness of the Catholic Church. There is no singular bishop over all of them, with some sort of role over them as presbyters. There is not one single synod of bishops. Matter of fact, there is multiple synods around the metropolitan, where all the ordination of other presbyters, bishops, is done. The initial councils and stuff that manage the day-to-day affairs, or the year-to-year affairs, be more precise, twice a year they meet, of all the dioceses in the metro. That is the workhorse part of the Orthodox Church in practice. Now, that has been distorted in recent times, since the last century, with what's happened in Constantinople, making all bishops metropolitans and undermining this metropolitan councils, contrary to tradition, and having collapsed everything to one council around the patriarch. This is an aberration of our tradition, and hopefully it'll be sorted out. It's not been followed in Serbia, it's not been followed in Russia, thankfully, but in the Greek-speaking areas, this contrariness to the apostolic tradition has taken place. So hopefully we repent of that. But nevertheless, you have the metropolitans gathered around exarchs, as I said, and exarchs gathered around patriarchs. And it's particularly the three patriarchs of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And that is a sort of a flat layer. Rome is first, but it's not over them. It doesn't have any authority to call them all to council, etc. The highest authority to call bishops into council is the patriarch, and Rome was not patriarch over all the other churches in the world. That's why he could never call an ecumenical council. He was simply a patriarch of one area, even though as Rome, he had a overall center of unity for all the churches. He could write letters to them. He could sometimes hear appeals from cases heard in other areas. That's fine. But that's a limit of a power. There's limits, and each layer goes up because the whole of the church, and there's no bishop of bishops, is in each diocese. the power of the metropolitans over can only exercise in consent of all the bishops, or any rule that applies to all. In other words, all the bishops decide that they will follow that custom, this rule, this practice in their diocese. None of them is forced. There's not that the metropolitan can order them to do such and such. No, the only way he can do something which is all of them together is they all agree. And because they've all agreed, they've all individually consented to it. That's their own choice. There's no imposition at all at this level. And the same with the patriarchal level. When basically the patriarchs are there to hear appeals and occasionally call wider synods for more pressing, wider matters that cover all the churches. But again, there's no imposition of their authority over the other ones. It's all done with consent. This is why you have the principle of consent. And it's actually really important is consent, unanimous consent. Not a majority rule, as you see in many cases today. That's the sense of imposition. This is saying majority tells the others what to do. No, that means that you have an authority over the local bishop, an authority over Christ. No, the authority is only exercised with consent of all. Now, there can be exceptions where one bishop is just being particularly silly and blocking things because he's some personal issue or battle with somebody else. That's allowed to push through this when that sort of thing is happening. But it's not about a majority rule. No, it's the seeking consent, because each diocese is the fullness of the church. There is no authority imposed upon it. It's done with its consent. So this is quite important. So the Orthodox Church is a federation, if you wish, of many churches gathered together around the patriarchs, around Rome, recognizing Rome as a center of its communion, giving it first place in the Ecumenical Councils, giving it first voice, and in all normal situations, remaining in communion with the See of Rome, because to break that communion is to go into sort of a type of schism. That would be, we should remain in union with Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch today as a sort of center of union. But that's only on the account that they're not becoming heretical, which we can break communion if they've become into open heresy. Where how to judge that is another matter. And so we still have that structure in the Orthodox Church. Whether it's been followed very well at the moment is another matter, but it's still there. But it's no bishop who's sort of over. It's not a sort of one synod of all bishops and under one, and he calls them into council as if one sort of group. This model is not there in the first centuries and is not there in Orthodox Church today. It's something peculiar idea that's coming into Roman Catholicism. It's probably since the time of the Schism or just before it. And this idea is what he's assuming in his discussions. And that's why there is he keeps pushing this over and over again. He confuses the position of Rome as first see with this high priest saying he fails to understand the diocesan expression of the high priest in relation to the presbyters, and he conflates the two. He's not doing it personally. This is a problem of Roman Catholic position overall, and this is where we are quite different from them in this overall model structure of how the churches relate to each other. As I said, Orthodox, in many churches gathered around the chief sees, and each diocese is the fullness of the church, is the Catholic Church, and they're all gathered around in a federation, forming together in unity around this principle. Roman Catholics, they teach there is one church in the Pope with all the bishops as sort of his presbyters over the whole world, and then that is modeled in each diocese as a sort of a particular expression of that fullness in that one place. But they have a sort of a different level of that. But the diocese isn't the fullness of the church. It's actually Peter and his cardinals, whatever one, the bishops, as a whole thing that is the church. And then that's replicated in miniature in each place. Whereas Orthodox, no, the full church is each diocese. The rest, the other structure above it is just a way of maintaining the unity of these churches.
Yeah, and you were mentioning what St. Gregory the Great, where he refers to the three C's of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, all being of Peter. And so the importance of Rome exclusively, I mean, from the Ecumenical Councils, it's clear that it's because it's the imperial city. I mean, it's the capital of the empire. And also through tradition, it's also doubly apostolic through St. Paul as well, right?
So Rome, yes. Now, just to get that clarified, Rome is set as first by the will of God. That's fine. Peter and Paul go there. That was important to recognize that Rome was to be the first place. It is recognized as first place because it's established as such by the apostles Peter and Paul. And it is specifically called Petrine as a symbol from the Gospels of its leadership, as too as Alexandria and Antioch. So this is all God's will, apostles' will. Why do they choose Rome? Because it liked the river Tiber? Because it happened to be a nice hills it was sitting on? No. They chose it because it was a capital city of the empire. It was where all roads go to Rome. It was the see most visible to all. It had all the best communications. Therefore, it was sensible that when you have the Church of the Gentiles, Rome was symbolically the first city of the Gentiles, of the nations. Rome was sort of, the empire was considered a gathering or unity of all the nations. Okay, it didn't actually control all nations, but it carried a symbol of the unity of all nations. And so it was a place for the first see, which is the chief testimony to the empire, to the nations, should be where the emperor was in Rome. Therefore, it's one of the most influenced with the empire and one of the greatest testament. All roads, everyone sees what's happening in Rome. Everyone can follow its customs, etc. There's no point picking at some little place in the middle of nowhere. So there's a reason that they went there. It was because it was the capital of the empire. Not that the capital of the empire, but the desire to make that the first see was from Christ, from the apostles. And there is an Petrine inheritance given to that see, which transcends the continuing relative status of the city in the empire for the generations to come. It was a map. It was an initial starting point to pick the see of Rome. But after that, it wasn't dependent on the empire in continuation. So that's why Rome stays the first see even after the city is sacked, falls, separated from the empire about 750 AD. It continues on as the first see because that's part of the tradition of the church. It maintains that despite the empire. So that is really important. But this is also why, though it's Christ's will, it's not because the emperor decided to do so. It is not simply to conform to the empire as the sake of conforming to empire and just continue with the empire, as I stated. And this is a church structure based on the where Rome was at the time, because that was an appropriate spot for the first see to be appointed. But interestingly, because it was Rome as the capital city, when Constantine made Constantinople New Rome, in other words, he identified it with Rome. It's the same capital as Rome. The fathers went, well, the apostles gave the priority of the first church to Rome because it was a capital city. So it goes to Rome, not because it was the city on the Tiber. It's not because of its geographical location. It's because it was the capital of the empire. And when Constantine identified Constantinople with Rome as New Rome, as the capital empire, then the fathers went, well, hold on a minute. The apostles and Christ decided that the seat at the capital empire, which happened to be Rome, it happened to be on the Tiber, it was to be made a first seat and have all the privileges of Peter. Well, this new city, which is Rome, and all identity in that identity, must therefore also receive the same privileges as old Rome, because it is the reason for giving a title is now true also of Constantinople. It is Rome. It is the capital of the empire. Therefore, the bishop here, to follow the obedience of Christ and the apostles, must receive the privileges of Peter. because it is the reason for giving it to Old Rome. It's the same here. So it's the same logic. So therefore, that's why they gave them the same privileges. They said they're equal, though it recognizes it second, so you don't end up with two-headed empire sort of thing. The Rome becomes sort of the prototype, and it's an image of that. But it's the same, takes the image of the privilege because it was the see of Rome. Though few people seem to get that, but that means it has all the equal privileges of Rome. It is Rome. And so in the Orthodox Church today, Constantinople stands as the see of Rome, did for the first 300 years, and did really until the Schism. We haven't lost anything of the authority of Rome amongst the churches today in its continuation in Constantinople. And that's why it always keeps saying New Rome. It's a see of Rome as far as we're concerned, in all practical things. So whatever we say about the see of Rome in the first millennium, it's true of Constantinople. It's only in the first millennium Old Rome had a certain priority for unity of New Rome, but when Old Rome fell into heresy, New Rome continues exactly the same authority, exactly the same position in the churches, among the churches. So yeah, the Orthodox Church has lost nothing of what was given to Rome by Peter. And in this sense, yes, New Rome is a Petrine see and carries all the authority of Peter, and it has stayed for the next 1,000 years as solid rock. I mean, there's some issues going on now, but nevertheless, Old Rome had certain issues as well, so that's okay. We can live with those little niggles.
Okay, so Father, you were talking about the privileges given to Constantinople as being equal with Rome. Now, I believe this comes directly from an ecumenical council, right?
Yes. This is first affirmed at the Second Ecumenical Council, where they recognize as Constantinople as having equal honor to Rome, because it was New Rome, but also recognized as coming second after her. So it still recognized a certain priority to Old Rome, but otherwise having equal same honor. And then at the Council of Chalcedon, the famous Canon 28 just goes into more depth about the equality, why it's equality, what the equality means, and then it also rebukes Constantinople for taking too much authority of that and respecting the proper authority of the metropolitans underneath to do ordinations of their own bishops, and they're smacking his hand for interfering with that and saying you can only ordain the metropolitans, it's not your job to do the bishops underneath. This is a structural, hierarchical structure I was talking about, the Metropolitan Councils being the most important aspect of that. This is why I think recently, over the last century, the changes in the Constantinople, this is actually contrary to the ecumenical canons and the structures of the church. But maybe there's certain necessity due to population sizes, but nevertheless, the restructuring was a disaster in terms of relation to the holy canons and the structure of the church. So anyway, Canon 28 just reinforced the equality of Rome and New Rome and just gave more expression why that was the case. But it was actually purposed at constraining the authority of Constantinople vis-a-vis the metropolitan the bishops. And in that Sixth Ecumenical Council reinforces the structure and the order of the churches of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and thereon after. Jerusalem is a patriarch, but it's not Petrine see per se. It is a see of honor for its the heritage of the see of St. James, etc. So it has an honor afterwards, but it's not strictly Petrine as such. It's not one that's founded by Peter. And then we have other patriarchs, but they take subsequent order after that and have limited jurisdiction. So again, they're not Petrine per se, but they are a way of managing churches in different regions, which would be too difficult to maintain under the patriarchs having to approve every ordination.
Yeah, and since he mentioned Saint Cyprian in that last segment, I just want to go back to somewhere he talks about with the keys given to Saint Peter, and he connects that to the founding of the church upon the bishops itself. So Peter is like this symbol of receiving the keys, and he represents the bishops. So yeah, I don't know if you anything to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's right. St. Cyprian does recognize a higher order of the sees, the metropolitans, the exarchs, and the patriarchs. Carthage was like an exarchate in there. It had its own metropolitans underneath in different regions. So it was a very senior see. But it to recognize Rome, but it had a certain independence from Rome, or autonomy from Rome as well. Yes, so, but again, he just reinforces what I was saying before, that the primary sense of the Petrine thing is the bishops, because that the whole church is present with Christ and the apostles in each place, with Peter as the one who is singled out to represent Christ among the apostles. That's what we see in each diocese. But we shouldn't, though there is an important Petrine role beyond the diocese. That is why we have Rome as a Petrine see along with Alexandria and Antioch. This is important to the structure of churches. It's part of our tradition. It is not the same high priestly ministry function. That's purely true of all the dioceses. This is another type of function which has a certain different type of relationship, much more equal relationship, because of the authority of those in the relationship is much higher. So yeah, there's multiple layers of this Petrine ministry as such.
Yeah, and like you were mentioned earlier, Saint Cyprian specifically rejects the idea of having a bishop of bishops.
Yes, he's very clear on that, and this is what the Roman model effectively is a bishop of bishops.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get back to the video here.
All of the apostles with the keys of the kingdom of heaven, if he didn't have, quote, power and priestly authority over them all, end quote, over the whole apostolic college, which was his Eucharistic community, his diocese, then it would follow that a local monarchical bishop, who's modeled after this same Peter, doesn't have any unique authority over his diocese either. Peter simply cannot be the model for all monarchical bishops if he himself didn't originally stand as the monarchical bishop, the key-bearer, over all of the apostles. Peter cannot be the symbol of high priestly authority in the church if he, personally, didn't act as the one high priestly shepherd of the apostolic college. However, if Peter does act as the one monarchical bishop in relation to the entire apostolic college, if he is the church's one shepherd, then this would mean that he and his successors have immediate, direct, and ordinary jurisdiction over the entire apostolic or episcopal college, just as local bishops, whose model or archetype is St. Peter, have the same authority.
Okay,
yes, that just is again just reinforcing that model that, but he's talking about the sort of apostolic choir, and is speaking of Peter as being a monarchical bishop vis-a-vis the other apostles. Again, it's going to this, well, I pulled out this monarchical thing, having this control over them, ordering them about. No, he was a center of unity, and he was first among them, but there wasn't, they were quite autonomous in many ways. Each one had his own space, they divided the world among themselves, so they didn't go over top of each other. So though he sort of stood as first, he definitely wasn't in the state of controlling them all, didn't deny their monarchical thing. And they weren't gathering around him for the liturgy every time. They were spread out and basically the centers of their own unity, of their own liturgies, etc. So I don't think we can speak of Peter as having the type of authority which he's speaking about vis-a-vis the other apostles. But even if he is first called out, even if he's more specific, got the keys given to him, yes, that represents the bishop being pulled out from the presbytery to take the place of Christ among the apostles in each place. So there is a certain sense where we can speak of Peter's leadership among the apostles. But that was then replicated in each diocese. The whole apostolic choir of Christ, as I said before, is represented in each diocese. The structure that goes beyond that is a different type of relationship because the fullness is given in each place. And so there is still a place of unity, but it's not one that is high priest over all the others. So that is, I think, where he's just sort of conflating two things. He's not quite seeing that model of St. Ignatius Antioch speaks about in each diocese of the Christ and the apostles. That is where it's fully put in. That resolves all his difficulties. And the wider relationships is a different type of thing, because those relationships have to take into account the mystical reality of each diocese, and therefore there is a limit on the authority. It cannot have an episcopal authority in all these places, because then there will be two bishops in each place. As I've said before in another discussion with someone else, that when you have a bishop has one voice, one will of consent in the diocese, that means only one voice is speaking to permission for all the presbyters to serve. When only one person is accepting all people to be baptized into the church, only one person is ordaining things. As soon as you've got the Pope of Rome turns up, and then there's two voices of consent, and then who overrides who? Well, if the Pope has any authority at all in the diocese and his voice overrides that of the bishop, then he fundamentally denies the bishop as bishop, because the bishop is one will, or one voice, one source of consent. There can be no other person exercising that without denying the bishop as bishop. So in this case, there cannot be, in principle, any other person who carries that particular authority inside this diocese. Therefore, there is no immediate jurisdiction of the Pope within. And the metropolitans didn't. They didn't act like that. Even they had a certain authority over calling the other bishops into council, etc. They could initiate some sort of trials, etc. They could depose the other bishops if the bishops broke the canons with the consent of the synod. They had no right to interfere within each diocese they were not bishops within that. And you don't see that in there. And in all but patriarchs, and even, as I said, the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Canon 28 forbade Patriarch and Constantinople from even ordaining bishops everywhere. He was constrained by the authority of the metropolitans. That's their job, not his job, to ordain the bishops. He only ordained the layout immediately under him, which is the metropolitan, but he didn't interfere with that. So the patriarch couldn't even interfere in the ordination of bishops in the synods underneath him. How much less could he go in and start doing ordinations or being the voice of consent? Now, also ordinations is really important. Only the local bishop can ordain a presbyter in his diocese. And so the Pope has no right to turn up and start ordaining it, because that will deny the bishop is the bishop, because the bishop is the one source of ordination. But this is what you see in the 11th century when Rome separates from the Orthodox Church. Immediately you get Pope Gregory VII, papal decretals, who says that the Pope has a right to ordain a presbyter or clergyman in any place he wishes. So he starts making this claim, and it's precisely this is where the whole church changes, and this is why you start to get all these mendicant orders, all these friars as Dominicans who could be under the Pope directly and have yet be in every other diocese, because before that, monasteries always under the bishop. There was no authority of a mother house which can control what happens in a monastery, transcending the authority of the bishop. The monastery is always under the authority of the bishop in his diocese. He has all that authority. There's no authority can come from outside over and into controlling something inside the diocese other than through himself. This is absolutely core to Orthodox understanding of the authority of the bishop and what it means to be a diocese. But so only when the papacy claims to have this immediate jurisdiction everywhere can these universal orders start taking a rise, because they're under him and therefore exercise authority everywhere because of his authority. That's something that's new. This is a change. This is where you see the rupture from the tradition. And this is assumed by Roman Catholics now. This is assumed in their thinking. But it's an innovation. It's an innovation in the 11th century, and it didn't exist beforehand. And the whole structure of the churches and the relationship with monasteries are all based on this. The bishop was the sole end of authority in the diocese. There's no one could have a second voice in ordination and consent, etc. And as soon as you do, you deny him being a bishop. This is really what happens in the papacy, as far as Orthodox is concerned. That the papal claims are denial of all other bishops. They say all these other bishops are bishops and they have their own authority. No, in practice, they're only doing so as sort of vicars of the papacy, and only as far as the papacy allows them to do in the consent of the papacy. But this is not Orthodox understanding. The bishop isn't constrained by some sort of consent of the metropolitan or the patriarchs to be a bishop, other than recognizing his ordination, other than as bishop, he is constrained by the traditions of the church and his practices, otherwise he can be removed. Because he can only be there as so far as he's portraying Christ to the apostles, to the church, as so far as he's following the faith of Christ, so far as he's obeying the rules, the laws of Christ, the canons of the church. That's his job, to implement the faith and the canons of the church. It's not to do his own opinions, etc. He's there as a model of Christ to implement and maintain the way of Christ. So if he breaks that, if he fails to do that, he can be deposed by the other bishops. But that's because there's certain canons that he can testify. Otherwise, he's free in there where he has a certain amount of shared authority. He has a certain place. No one can judge him on that. He has certain decisions he makes. If he chooses to ordain so-and-so or something, no one else can interfere with that. And as long as he's within the scope of a canon, that's his authority, and no one else is can judge him on that. It's only God that stands as judge on that matter.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to the Dictatus Papae, which is around the time of the Schism. But I mean, it's interesting in that it says that the Pope is the bishop of bishops, and this goes against what Saint Cyprian said earlier, and also goes against the early ecumenical councils, which say that you can't interfere in the affairs of the other patriarchs.
Yeah, that's right. It goes against St. Gregory the Great, who says there's no universal bishop. And precisely what they claim is the Pope is a universal bishop. He has a universal jurisdiction in all places. It's exactly what St. Gregory said. No, you cannot have such a bishop. That is fundamentally wrong. If he falls into heresy, the whole church goes into heresy. It's fundamentally forbidden, which is why we have to have infallibility doctrines and all the rest of it going on. But this wasn't what the Church of St. Gregory the Great, that even though Rome was very important, had a lot of authority, centre of union, of union, first voice in the Ecumenical Councils. Without Rome, you really couldn't hold an Ecumenical Council. Fine, you can't sort of chop the head off of the first church and go and have a church that proclaims to hold the common faith of all people without its expression. It has the first voice in the Ecumenical Council. That's all fine. But this idea of universal bishop was one of the core innovations. And this innovation underlies so much of what we see in this video. And it's a failure to understand what Ignatius of Antioch was saying about what it means to be a bishop among the presbyters, which many Orthodox also struggle to understand as well. So it's a common problem, but this is really underlying. All he's saying is weakened by this failure to understand some of these basic ecclesiastical structures and rights.
Okay, let's continue.
Way in which the chair of Peter can truly ground the canonical standing of the worldwide episcopate, something that, as demonstrated in my article, Eastern Orthodoxy has no ability to do. In my estimation, the error that many Eastern Orthodox apologists make when espousing Eucharistic ecclesiology is supposing that episcopal primacy was first divinely instituted at the local level, i.e., one bishop with immediate, direct, and ordinary jurisdiction over his regional diocese, and then Vatican I's universal primacy was later mistakenly modeled after this. But this is exactly backwards. As has been shown in my article, episcopal primacy started at the universal level and flowed downstream from there.
Okay, so what do you have to say about that?
Well, yes, gets a little complicated. I think Eucharistic ecclesiology is a little limited. Obviously, I've criticized it myself. But that's not the Orthodox full doctrine in and of itself. It is just a theory of trying to explain it. So Orthodox do hold the importance of the metropolitans with unity and the patriarchs. So you've got to be in communion with your patriarch and metropolitan as a bishop. This is clear in the canons of a Council of Holy Wisdom, or the second council, that's right, in 861 AD. And so we've very much got a sense of the need for patriarchs, and the Petrine sees the importance of Constantinople for communion. So we're not just at that the episcopal sees are absolutely autonomous in themselves or autocephalous in themselves. No, we need metropolitan synods to ordain bishops and in the communion of the churches, and these need to be held together in union as one large family, one nature with the patriarchs. So we definitely do have a structure in place there. That's set up through the canons and the relative relations and the traditions there, which we can maintain to this day. We don't need a bishop of bishops for this. We just need a structure where we recognize certain sees as having certain priorities, and that Constantinople has a certain universal role, but with limits on that to respect the authority of every other one underneath it. That is what our structure. We've got that in place. That's no problem. Sometimes Eucharistic ecclesiology in itself can become problematic. Now, as I said, the state of Christ and the apostles comes first, and Peter is first of the apostles, sets up, and it's a universal structure. So in a sense, yes, that is first. But then that structure is replicated in every place. So when the apostles go around ordaining presbyters in every place, this is exactly what they're doing, is they're replicating this structure in every place. And it's Ignatius of Antioch says, the structure with the presbyters in every place, one of whom was pulled out, the apostles in every place, one of whom is distinguished as Peter in every place, who takes a sort of mystical role of Christ among the apostles. This was established in every place. So we can talk about the bishops in every place. We can talk about the presbyters in every place. We can talk about the presbyters and Roman Clements. They're talking of the presbyters. Yes, in each diocese there are the presbyters. It's not just the bishop, local bishop, just sort of by himself there. It is him with the apostles, the presbytery, and one of them is distinguished out as the place of Paul, Peter, in a sense, who was one of the apostles. And then he, in a mystical sense, takes on the place of Christ among the apostles. But he is one of the apostles. He's a priest among priests, which is why in the 14th century, when the bishop serves liturgy, it's unfortunately not done today, the bishop removes any sign of being a bishop when he actually offers the liturgy from just before the gospel. He actually offers dressed in exactly the same way as all the presbyters around him. He is a priest among priests. In a sense, even the presbyters are in a way high priests, but he's high priest, but there's a certain sense, there's a one priesthood shared by them all. The stronger separation of high priest and priest you see in the Old Testament is shrunk a lot in Christ. But there is still a distinction. But in the liturgy, he takes off the distinction of high priest. He just stands as priest among priests, as offering the gifts, in a sense. So this is where Peter is the apostle among the apostles, though he has a mystical place at times of Christ among the apostles. So we have sort of both mysteries, both things recognized the same. That's why you get all this, the early New Testament writings, the early fathers sometimes talk about the presbytery, and they don't make the absolute distinction between bishop and presbyters we have now, because we've got to understand that in every place there was the presbytery, the presbyters with one whom was singled out as the bishop. That was the structure set in every place. So, and then, yes, from the start, we also have the structure of metropolitan regions, because that's necessary to ordain other bishops, recognize new bishops. And it's also necessary to hear appeals for the structure. And right from the word go, you get the Petrine sees as principal centers of unity for the churches, and even exarchates. Like Asia, you have a principal see across all the regions of Asia. And for the unity of the churches, this was set up from there. So, yeah, the whole structure is there from the beginning. The diocese structure is taken from the apostles and Christ and the apostles, which is a universal structure that's put in. But there was no sense of what he's talking about is that, we go to Rome first, we have this universal church set up, and then we start making all the other dioceses as a sort of little replications of that. That's not what happens. The local churches start forming first, and then as they grow, it's pulled out as a sense of union of the churches of the nations. Once Jerusalem starts to drop down, it starts taking greater priority at that stage as a sort of slightly later, but nevertheless apostolic institution. But Jerusalem takes the first place initially as the first see, the see of most importance. And then only once the sort of the end of the Jewish sort of gospel time, and then it becomes for the Gentiles, then Rome takes its full place, 50, 60 AD, as the first of churches, and with Alexandria and Antioch. And that's fine. So that Rome wasn't immediately, it didn't run off to Rome, make the church there, set it all up, and then start making the other churches. No. The local churches were being formed. Jerusalem was first for a while, and then later this comes in. So I don't think he is correct in his inversion of the thing. And in any case, we don't even believe that what he was talking about ever existed, was sort of universal see in Rome and Peter as a sort of universal bishop over all the bishops. We don't believe that. He had a relationship with the apostles like that among the apostles, but that was distinct from when each church was become localized. It was replicated in each diocese. So, yeah, I'm not seeing this as consistent with the history of a church.
Yeah, so he basically has it backwards, right?
Look, he has it distorted because of his idea of the Peter having some sort of high priest role among the other apostles, and that this was there's a sort of universal church thing with a bishop of Rome, with the magisterium, all the bishops sort of underneath him as one sort of huge synod, as if he's a bishop among all of them as presbyters. That's because he's got this model in his head, and that's distorting what he's saying. So in the sense, there is a universal sense that comes first. That's Christ and the apostles. Yes, that has to take first. And then it goes to the diocese. But the structure which he's talking about with Rome as being the successors of Rome, and the see of Rome having this universal sense over that, though it was set up very early, I can't, it's almost synonymous with it. So I'm not saying it's sort of thing, but what he's talking about is this sort of structure of a universal church, which is the innovation in the 11th century, has been set up first. No, that never existed, that structure. But there is a certain things that it's not like the churches went we've got the local diocese. Let's make our universal church afterwards. Again, it didn't exist. So that order which he's talking about, no, it didn't happen either. we started the local church and then go on there. No, there's a certain correctness about what he was saying. It's just that the structure which he's talking about didn't exist, and so it's really irrelevant to that. But we must be careful that the opposition was saying that's not correct either. They're sort of synonymous and together and working together in each of its own place.
Okay, let's get back to the video. We'll go a little bit further here.
Yes, a lot of his other material, he's just giving biblical allusions and reinforcing what he's saying. But as I was saying, it doesn't matter. We agree all that material. It's how we're applying it, which is what is that issue.
Right, he's just reading a Vatican I papacy into these biblical teachings, pretty much.
Yeah. So we accept all those. So that's why I'm just sort of skipping over them, and I don't have to give an answer to them. That's fine. As you say, most of this I can answer. My first answer basically summarizes most of the points he's making here. But I'm just going through little tweaks of the bits and pieces so that we can get a broader picture of how ecclesiology works.
Right.
Used here for torn is from schisma, where we get our word schism. Peter's role is to bring the church to the eternal shore without letting it rupture through schism, end quote.
All right, I know you want to say something about that briefly.
Yes, we fully agree with that. I mean, we have one bishop, and he's a center of unity. And one of the reasons why all the presbyters have to get his consent for serving, for baptizing, etc., is so that, and he sort of oversights all the souls. So we accept that as in each diocese. That's for unity. And because we all come to Christ for our salvation, it's not people coming to me as a presbyter or the apostles or such. Our unity is in Christ. Therefore, everyone who's baptized and put on Christ should be known by the bishop, so that he is the shepherd looking after all the souls around. So when the apostles are gathering and baptizing, they're bringing it into Christ. So he should be aware of everyone coming to united with him. So this is why it's one of the mysteries of the bishop consenting to every baptism. He should be aware of any person coming into it. He's responsible for each soul that comes in as a general oversight. That's not the ministry authority of the presbyter to act as priest, to baptize, etc. And his doing so according to the canons of the church, according to the traditions of the church. It's not that the bishop is micromanaging him, but it's to set this mystery that everyone that's been brought into the church is being brought into union with Christ. And so that is manifest, that's reinforced by the bishop's consent. And again, the ordination coming from one source, that is Christ as the one source. So we very much that the bishop gathers together in unity, holds unity. And also at the level of metropolitans, the patriarchs, the seer, that is there to help form unity of the churches. It's a principle to added on function. It doesn't stop people going to schism, but it's adds a layer of, well, if you're going to go into discommunion with Peter, you are going to schism by one principle. Therefore, you either have to justify he's a heretic, or you're overturning the apostolic tradition. It just adds an extra layer of breaks to stop schisms happening too quickly. You've just got an extra idea of responsibility of, if I'm going to go in, then I'm going to be having a problem according to leaving Peter. So it just means that justification is more necessary, or you've decided that they're all heretics and you've got your own opinion. But yeah, so that's why he helped. It doesn't stop the schisms, but it certainly helps to keep the sense of a unity and reach and slow down schisms.
Yeah, so this would be the duty of the first see in general, right?
Yeah. And all the Petrine sees, etc., there's centers of unity of the local churches, and they have a general oversight to ensure the unity of the churches. Yes, that's just perfectly fine.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump a little bit further ahead here.
Net robe of Christ, end quote. As St. Jerome taught, since Peter is the one who eliminates all occasions for schism, since the rock on which the church is built continues to be the chair of Peter in Rome, the Pope's is the house where alone the paschal lamb can be rightly eaten, and he that gathers not with Peter and his successors during the Eucharist scatters. Once again, while there certainly is a relative sense in which the other apostles and bishops are successors of Peter, this simply cannot be to the detriment of Simon Peter's historical role among the apostles, which was to keep them all unified around one Eucharistic table while the church grew among the nations, a reality that was symbolized by Peter alone bringing the fish to the Lord's table on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. In the
Okay, Father.
Yeah, so as I said, I think this is much better represented by the bishop among his presbyters, especially at the Eucharistic sense of one table. That's why the bishop alone ordains all the altars, the tables, that there is one Eucharist, because there's one ordained consecrator of all the tables, which is why in Orthodox Church today we have the anti-mincing from the bishop. Though I think there's a modern twist on that. What matters is that the altar being consecrated, once it's consecrated, it doesn't need a new anti-mincing on it. It's fine, it doesn't need an anti-mincing. Anti-mincers are only there in case there's no consecrated altar. And so once it's consecrated by a bishop of the diocese, there's no need for a new bishop to come and reconsecrate it. The point is that it was consecrated by the bishop and not by just the presbyters. It stays in the unity of the church from successor to successor of the bishops. But in modern times, they seem to each bishop wants to hand out there's new anti-mincians, because there's a slight distortion that means that the presbyters sort of only serves when the new anti-mincing comes out with this new bishop's name on it. No, I think this is a sort of a corruption that's going on in these days. And so the anti-mincing is turning from being a portable altar into some sort of license sheet. But anyway, that's just by on the side. But yes, that's what the bishop does. And in the liturgical sense, yes, that's what we see in each diocese. It's not the relationship which the patriarchs have or metropolitans have with the other bishops. They're not giving out anti-mincians to the other bishops to serve. They're not giving out their consent for them to serve. And they recognize each other as in the church and as bishops, and the Eucharist in each place. That's part of their recognition. If they stopped recognizing the bishop, everyone meant, no, he's no longer a bishop, then that bishop would be cut off and there would be no Eucharist on his table. So if it is done reasonably and for a just cause, such that he has fallen to sin or into heresy, so there is a sense that the patriarchs do have an authority if they depose a bishop or recognize a certain synod has gone into schism to cut them off, and there is no. But other than that, the type of thing he's talking about is diocese and bishop relationship to his presbyters. And I don't think I see any support in history that we should lift this up, other than the fact that they've got this new sort of post-schism idea of what the church is, a structure of what the church is, and this is why he's speaking about it and assuming that, and having failed to understand, again, as I keep repeating, the proper relationship between Peter and the apostles in each diocese.
All right, so Father, would you say that he's confusing the role of Peter with the role of the Pope, like exclusively, instead of looking at the whole episcopate?
I think he is inclined to collapse the role of Peter too much into Rome, too exclusively into Rome, though he does recognize and is willing to talk about the Petrine of each bishop. He basically just tickles that a little bit and just holds it there, but he's really focusing on Peter in Rome as the Bishop of Rome. Again, it's coming back to this model of some sort of universal church, a universal priest, high priest of all the churches, that all the bishops are sort of like his presbyters underneath them. And there's sort of one universal council, magisterium, etc. It's all tied up and distorted by his model here, which he takes priority. Therefore, the local bishop is only sort of a derivative of that, as he says, rather than the local bishop being the primary and fullest expression of that. And because the local bishop is the fullness of that, the other structures above our Petrine have to be act in the regard of limited jurisdiction in a sense of authority within the diocese, within the metropolis, to respect the authority of the local bishop, because he's the fullness of the Catholic Church. The fullness of the authority of Peter is recognized in the local diocese. The universal authority in Rome is one that's constrained by the recognition of the authority in each diocese, in each metropolis, in each patriarch. He cannot interfere with those authorities in there. Though he still has a Petrine function of uniting the churches together, and that's fine. It just has to respect the authority. So the principal one is not him, and this is where we talked about which comes first. But if we talk about what is in principle, yes, the diocesan structure of the bishop and the presbyters is the full and total expression of the Petrine authority's position, and the higher layers are also Petrine, but they have a limited authority in respect of that fullest expression in the diocese. And so, yes, Rome does have a first place, it's an important place. It is a Petrine see, it has a certain authority among all the other churches, but only in the context of respecting the authority of all the layers underneath it.
Yeah, it also it reminds me of something I've heard. It was called the Peter syndrome. That anytime Peter is mentioned, the Roman Catholics they automatically assume that it refers to the Pope of Rome.
Yes, because they've taken, and this is why we reinforced earlier about the Petrine sees in 3 bishops: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. They've made it exclusive to Rome. And a matter of fact, when the schism came along, they just had Rome. They schismed away from the other 2 Petrine sees, Alexandria and Antioch, which were also Petrine, therefore also rocks, also stable, also, or whatever you talk about Petrine authority, that belongs to them too. So other than Rome has a slightly more universal jurisdiction of a Petrine authority, Alexandria and Antioch are equally Petrine when it comes to the stability of rocks, center of communion. And they deny that. They deny that heritage of the church. They deny the teachings of Gregory the Great many times. Though they try to fudge over it and say he doesn't mean this and that. No, they're going contrary to his teaching. They've thrown out, they denied the Petrine identity because they said they've fallen in schism. Whoa, what do you mean? And as a matter of fact, it's the Orthodox who've got the stronger position because Rome is being maintained at Constantinople, and therefore old Rome going away didn't lose anything in the Petrine promises of the church at all. It just showed that they decided to exclusively put it all to itself, got to a state of pride, and okay, get cut off. But nothing was missing from the Petrine authority privileges needed for the unities of the churches that wasn't present within the Orthodox structure. And it was better kept in that way than their exclusive claim to Petrine authority, which they just twisted and distorted into something beyond what was the tradition of the church. And this them exclusively in themselves, exclusively in the Holy Father, which becomes effectively a cult of the Bishop of Rome. And it gets worse as time goes on. And since Vatican I, Vatican II, and because of mass communication, easy transport, this cult is getting stronger and stronger than it was even in the Middle Ages.
Right. Good. Let's go back to the video.
Words, take and eat, end quote. These words, quote, echo the Eucharist and thereby signify Peter's role in Eucharistically sustaining the oneness of the body of Christ, Jew and Gentile, in the one untorn net robe of Christ, end quote. As St. Jerome taught, since Peter is the one who eliminates all occasions for the table on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. In the end, this is why Eastern Orthodox, and really any non-Catholic ecclesiology, just doesn't work. The historical man Peter had a real headship over all of the apostles that was directly and immediately given to him by Christ the Lord. Peter's ministry simply was not identical to the rest of the apostles. It was singular and unique. Even though the other apostles and bishops could be local Peters, images of what Peter fully was, they couldn't be Peter himself. And yet, it was Peter's ministry that was singled out as the means by which the church would withstand the gates of hell until the end of time.
Okay, Father?
Yes, so just going back to the same problems, that this is truly the bishop. And again, that the authority of Peter over the apostles, I think he's reading far too much into what that authority was. Yes, he was singled out from among them. Yes, he was given the keys first. Yes, he was a prince of the apostles. But we don't see anywhere in the scriptures where he's going around into their different places and giving them consent to do this, that they have to ask his consent before they go to mission here or there. That everyone they're baptized, they have to ask his consent. This is what the role of a bishop is. He's not ordaining them, ordaining all their clergy. No, I've seen nothing of that. And a matter of fact, when he turns up into Antioch and has that debate with Paul, he submits to Paul. Well, what is this? If he was absolutely one, there was no way that Paul would be speaking to him like that, or him submitting to Paul. That would be an anathema. No. Yes, he's first of the apostles. Yes, he's prince of the apostles. Fine. But he's reading far too much into the authority that he assumes he has, and especially liturgical authority. And I'm not seeing that there at all. And Paul has equal authority in all these respects. And so I think he's reading far too much into it. And so, yes, that's all I've got to say, really. It's just this distortion that comes through the Papis Dictate of Gregor VII when they start claiming this sort of universal episcopal jurisdiction, which is symbolized by ordaining clergy everywhere. That was the particular thing he says that is the universal bishop thing, because that's what the bishop primarily does, is ordination of clergy. That is his unique role, in claiming that he can ordain clergy everywhere is to claim a universal episcopal jurisdiction. And that's only seen in the urban centuries, never heard of beforehand.
Yeah, and he's failing to see what the second millennium papacy became. I mean, they claimed supremacy over all things spiritual and temporal, over all emperors even. So
yeah, well, that's another problem, is a proper respect to emperors. In the first millennium, the Ecumenical Councils were called by emperors because all the bishops, including Rome, were obedient to the emperor, and that's why they came. It's precisely because he was obedient to the emperor, as Paul says, we must obey the emperor. Not that he has to obey the emperor when the emperor contradicts Christ. Of course not. We stand against the emperor because the emperor's authority is only so good as it's the consistency of Christ. But the emperor did have authority over the Pope to order him into a council. That was fine. That's part of a secular power, and there's no offense to Christ or the emperor to ask the bishops to come and tell him what the faith of the church is. That's their duty to go and tell him what the faith of the church is. Now, the Pope might ask the emperor to call a council because there's some issue he wants to address at a universal level. Then he has to ask the emperor to do so. And of course, the emperor can't just force a universal council without the representation of the papacy. That would be like saying, oh, here's everybody's expression. Oh, but let's leave the first see out. His opinion doesn't matter. What are you talking about? That's distinct about who actually turns up. And interestingly, the Pope of Rome never went to the ecumenical councils. Again, it's sort of reinforcing that he had no authority to call them, and that he didn't even have to be absolutely present. His legates could be present instead. So that was one of the quirks. Even if Vigilius was in there in Constantinople at the time, he still didn't manage to turn up, which is one of the quick things. But I think that was God's providence. The Pope never did turn up. So all these pictures you see the Pope in charge of ecumenical councils, that's a complete lot of nonsense. He wasn't. The emperor was in charge of the things, even though the legates and Pope had the first voice and the first say, and the letters of the Pope was the first thing read, and that usually what he said was enough for the decision. Everybody just basically agreed because the orthodoxy of Rome was quite strong. So but anyway, it's what he's talking about there. I don't see it in the traditions of the church. It's totally absorbed by this later thing. Oh, that's right. It was the other thing was that was one of the biggest schisms of the church. Actually happens in the 9th century of Leo III when he ordains, consecrates Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor. He took an authority which did not belong to him. The appointing of rulers, of who is ruler, is a secular matter determined by the secular processes of the empire, whatever those may be. The church then blesses the one chosen, consecrates them, and they give them the Christian. But the actual process of choosing it is a secular thing, and only a secular thing. And unless it's chosen properly by the empire, the proper source of the empire, even if it happens to be someone murdering the previous emperor, okay, but it's part of how the empire works. But for him to choose someone outside the emperor and put him into place by his decision, and actually say that, okay, you are the emperor, without it being a Charlemagne actually conquering the empire, that was a breach of the unity of the empire. It's an overextension of his authority. And that's really when the churches started to fall apart, because the unity of the empire had been breached at that time. So yes, and then he starts claiming to have authority over all secular rules. That made the church a secular power and a secular authority. You have papal states, papal armies, etc. The church has lost the point. Then it becomes an institution of the earth. It's no longer the heavenly institution standing alongside or in the empire, but above the empire at the same time. It's interesting dynamic there that takes place. It's not that the emperor had any authority to order things in the council. When he did, it usually was a heretical interference, but he had authority to call the council and to say when the council was closed, and to put it into law of the empire. But he didn't have authority to determine what the faith actually was, to speak in there. And it's only because he wasn't a priest that he could call it, precisely because he was a secular ruler, not the church ruler. That's why the Pope couldn't do it. He specifically, as one of the priests, he was not allowed to call it an ecumenical council. That was forbidden to prevent the church falling into heresy. So this is why it was an emperor did it instead, because of obedience of the bishops, including the Pope, to the emperor. So all this is a distortion and a twisting of what the relationship between church and state was for the first at least 800 years, and it started to get a bit muddy after that.
Okay. Let's get to the last segment.
Of time and not die with Peter in the 1st century. However, the man Simon Peter did die in the 1st century, in Rome, as Christ foretold. As such, if Peter's ministry was supposed to last until the end, but the man himself did not live until the end, the only explanation is that Peter must have a successor who will allow his ministry to be carried out perpetually. And, as demonstrated at length in my article, the holy tradition of both East and West identifies the Pope of Rome as just that successor. Certainly, neither the Patriarch of Constantinople, nor the Patriarchs of Alexandria or Antioch, nor the Archbishop of Canterbury, nor any Lutheran, Reformed, or Evangelical pastors have any serious claim to being, in the words of the Council of Ephesus, quote, the prince and head of the apostles, pillar of the faith and foundation of the Catholic Church, end quote. The best contender for that claim is and always has been the Roman Pontiff, and so shall it be until our Lord returns in the glory of his Father.
All right, Father.
Well, I'm just pushing back on this, saying that the Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria can't claim this. They are Petrine. Well, Alexandria and Antioch are Petrine sees. They do claim this a continuation of the inheritance of the authority of Peter in themselves. They are Petrine sees. The inheritance passed from bishop to bishop. They still, that's why they are patriarchs. That's why Alexandria's 2nd see. That's why Antioch's 3rd see, because they are Petrine. And they remain as such because they inherit the Petrine authority from generation to generation. As I said, Constantinople is recognized as having equal privileges because it takes the privileges of Peter itself. And from generation to generation, whoever sits on the see of Constantinople in New Rome exercises the authority passed on, just as they did in Old Rome. So that he's making a mistake there. Now, yes, in the early writings, etc., especially the Western ones, you see a priority of Rome, of the see of the Apostolic See, of the See of Peter, because it was in the West the primary see, and it was the first see. Of course, in a sense, there's a one see of Peter, there's a unity. So quite often we'll speak of the unity in the terms of its head, of the first, as in a singular sense, not that there's lots of different ones sort of coming together by some sort of consent, but there is a unity of one and from many. So that's not surprising, we see that. But it's when you start forgetting that this is a 1 and 3, a 1 and 4 in a sense, and that these other seeds also have the same sense of inherited. It belongs to the throne, and it goes from generation to generation. Yes, and also, and when Peter dies, every bishop inherits that authority in his diocese, sitting on every bishop sits on the throne. And it's not that the see of Petrine promises is handed off from Peter to his successor, who ordains his success when he's alive, and then the successor ordains his success when he's alive. That's the only way you'd have the Petrine privileges sort of from person to person. But this is not how it works. Peter dies, then his successor is chosen after he dies. And he's ordained by the other bishops who are not on the sees of Peter. Well, the power then is not in being passed on from man to man. It's not the other bishops, the cardinals, don't have the power of Peter. It comes when they ordain a bishop for the throne. It's on whoever sits on the throne inherits the power. So this throne is true of Antioch and Alexandria, as I said, and of Constantinople. Whoever sits on that throne exercises the authority that comes with that throne. So again, it's not like a person-to-person thing. It's an authority embedded in the throne, which lasts as long as the throne lasts. And even Rome, God keeps his promise to it in a sort of superficial sense of there's still been someone there, the throne's still been there, there's still a so-called Bishop of Rome to this day. But it is in heresy, so we put him aside and follow the Orthodox inheritors of the Petrine promise, who can keep the faith of Christ, is why Peter is singled out because of his declaration of faith. And as soon as they broke that declaration, they lost the place of Peter. They were given plenty of chance to turn away from the heresy, but they didn't. They persisted, and God eventually, due to their insistence on that, even though he protects them, he does protect them. He does try to stop them falling. When we're talking about these seas of Petrine seas, while we accept that they can fall and there's a certain freedom of man in the sea, God does his best to stop that, but it's generation after generation keep persisting on things. Then there's a time when he has to move himself away from that. He won't push it until it becomes a contradiction. But otherwise, yeah. And so same with Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. They've been very stable for the last millennium. There's been very few heretics. There's been the odd one, the odd problem. But they've only been short-lived, 1 or 2 in a row at the most. But the seas have stayed orthodox right up until the 20th century, even to today. It's starting to get questionable to today. But nevertheless, they've shown great stability, just as much as stability as ever as in the first century. So, we can see the Petrine promises are actually being kept in the East, according to maintaining the faith of the Church.
Right. And if you look in the Fathers, I mean, it looks like their main concern with Peter and his successors is the continuing of the faith itself.
Yeah, that is the primary apostolic faith, apostolic tradition, to be more precise. It is not just the faith of God, it is a tradition of the way we worship, the way we pray, the way we live, and the structures of the church, etc. That is things that the apostles passed on, the traditions that they gave them to us, just as we keep them just as they have been passed on to us. That's the core teaching of the Seventh Ecumenical Council is maintaining the traditions of the church. And the papacy and the patriarchs, that's their job, is to maintain the tradition, both in its faith and its canons. And that's the biggest problem with Rome. It has failed to do so. If they managed to do so at some level, and they hadn't kept changing and contradicting themselves and throwing this out and denying that there is the discipline of the traditions don't matter, it only matters just faith, and they start saying one thing and then saying another thing in their doctrines, and they start contradicting themselves. The evidence is not there that they're actually keeping the faith of the church. Therefore, they're not maintaining Peter's. They've got the external structure of it, but where it comes down to it, maintaining tradition of the church and maintaining the faith, it's not there to be seen. And so that is the biggest thing that undermines their claim. Okay, we've got the structure. Okay, the early fathers talked about the Petrine promises and all that, and they do focus on Rome, but the reality is that they haven't maintained it. And the only way you can say that what it has been maintained is by seeing that in the faith has been maintained in Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. They too have the Petrine privileges, patroncies, so they too must be the legitimate Petrine heirs, I should say.
Yeah. Before we close, I just wanted to read a couple quotes on the fathers here. This is Saint Gaudentius, I believe how you pronounce it. Referring to Saint Ambrose of Milan. He says, "I beseech our common father Ambrose, let him speak from that Holy Spirit which he is filled, and from his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And as successor of Peter, he shall be the mouth of all the surrounding priests. For when the Lord Jesus asked the apostles, 'Whom do you say that I am?' Peter alone replies, with the mouth of all believers, 'Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God.'" And then Pope St. Leo the Great, when commenting on the power of binding and loosing, he says, "This power is confided to him in a special manner because of the type of Peter is proposed to all the pastors of the church. Therefore, the privilege of Peter dwells wherever judgment is given with his equity." So,
yeah, that's very good.
So, okay. All right. Well, I think that should be it for today.
Yep, that's good. Well, yes, thank you for inviting me on again for another discussion. And God willing, we'll be back again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Father. Thanks for joining me again, and have a good evening.
You too. Bye for now.
Okay, goodbye.